a special treat, an author who has influenced me quite a bit over the years. It's been a long time since I spoke to him. Last time we talked about unified field theory, and that file got lost on a dead computer. That computer is completely frazzled and fizzled. But thankfully, Dr. Farrell has agreed to come back, and tonight we're going to talk about some of his works. What I'd like to start with is something that's a little bit difficult. I found, I think the first time I looked at the topological metaphor chapter in the Giza book, it was very confusing because I was still, pretty relatively new to Neoplatonic theory and looking at, a lot of these Greek terms. It was fuzzy, but I think I have a much better handle on it nowadays. So what I'd like to do is get you to kind of maybe go into some of this, give us an explanation of it, and then how that kind of undergirds where you take a lot of your other research and work.
Well, it's an unusual idea. The Harvard Norton Poetry Lectures for 1973. They're titled The Unanswered Question, but what he does in those lectures is he takes music and explains it using Chomskyan models of grammar to non-musical audiences. So basically what he's doing is he's doing music theory, or a kind of meta music theory in a way, and showing kind of common structures that occur both in language and in music. And that really kind of inspired me, because what he was doing there is he was taking analogical thinking to a very high pitch. And I started playing around with it. I actually bought Chomsky's books as a result of watching those lectures and read them, and his linguistics books. And I started playing around with basically a kind of topology of analogies, if you want to look at it that way. And I came to, eventually, this is a work that I've been doing for quite some time when I had the time to do it. I came to the conclusion that if you took the various metaphysical systems that existed in classic times, Neoplatonism you mentioned being one of them, you could do the same with Vedic systems, you could do the same even with Christian systems, with Buddhist systems, and took away all of the language and used a symbolic notation for what they were talking about. Something very interesting occurs, and I call it the topological metaphor of the medium, because this gets to be a particularly intriguing way to look at Platonism, Neoplatonism, some of the Hermetic texts. So let's do a thought experiment to explain what it is, or try to. Let's do it that way. It's always better to say to try, because sometimes I'm not too good at putting this into speech. But imagine a sea of infinitely extended sameness. In other words, you cannot imagine any distinctions within it. This would be what the Neoplatonists would call simplicity, or aplotis. But you could also say it's a nothing in the physics term, because in the physics sense, because in physics, in order to be a something, it has to be observable. It has to have distinction.
Right.
Now imagine you take this nothing or no thing and cleave it. At the very instant that you do, in other words, you're imagining a mathematical function which itself allows you to do this, and that function is itself negatively specified, all right? So in other words, you're making a kind of a formal definition. Imagine there exists a function that allows you to do this, so you cleave it. Now, what do you have when you cleave that nothing? You have three things, actually. You've got what topologists would call a region, one region, you have another region, and then you have the common surface between the two, which is itself a nothing, and it's also infinite. So you've got three infinities, but the difference now is what you've started to do, in at least the mathematical terms, is you started to add information to the system, all right? And in the formal description, this is a very important point for people to understand. In the formal description of each of these three things or three nothings, differentiated nothings, as it were. What you've done is you've added information, but the formal description still contains the symbolization of the original nothing that you've cleaved.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, what you've also done is you've set up, if I can put it this way, you've set up a mathematical formalization of an analogical process, because analogies, if you look at them carefully, analogies, when you move from one context to another and say, oh, this is analogous to that, this in language is to that in music, what you've done is you've noticed that there's some common element, and I'm using that term very deliberately, there's some common element between these two contexts that carries over. So in other words, you're setting up the conditions of analogical thinking, which to me is a fascinating result, because when you get to the Neoplatonists, when you get to some of the Egyptian thinking, when you get to the Hermeticists, this is what you see them doing. And one of the things I thought was very interesting about this is it gives kind of a convenient way to show why in so many of those ancient cultures you had the practice of sympathetic magic. Right. You had it because in their cosmology you had this idea that everything came from some primordial nothingness, ex nihilo. So it became a way for them to relate everything to everything else, to have a transcendental unity to things. Right. But it's also a very analogical process. So that in brief.
Well, no, that's great. That's great. Let me ask you this, if you don't mind. So this is the same pattern that I see with what we see with, say, the Egyptian deities, as you mentioned, where the deities kind of come to stand for these principles, right, these mathematical forms or whatever. And so if you thought about it in terms of geometry, this is essentially the same point that's being made in Pythagoreanism, where you have a dot, right, and then the extension from the dot is the line, and then that creates, like you said, three things, because you have the point, the line, and then wherever the point terminates. Right. So we're back. That's where we get a plane from, and so the plane would then be, a 1D dimension reality. So, right, would it be correct to say that it's the Greek idea of what they call the nomon, that the sort of a fractal mirroring of things is what's going on here?
Yeah, I like that idea of fractal. You mentioned the Pythagoreans, and I assume that what you're referring to there is the tetrakas, the right, one dot, and then you've got right, two, then you've got three, and you've got four. And to them, this was one of the great secrets, of their mystery school. And you have to wonder why, it's just a bunch of dots in a triangle. Right. And but when you look at it, as you say, when you look at it with kind of geometrical or topological lenses on, what they're really describing is something very profound. You start out with a point or a dot, or in mathematical terms, a scalar or one-dimensional entity. Then you go to two, that's a two-dimensional entity. You go to three, that's three dimensions. And you go to four, which is interesting because that implies four spatial dimensions. Right. Now, that may seem to some of our listeners, that may seem to be just the wildest sort of, bizarre and out-of-the-box speculation. But there's something very interesting to note about the Babylonians. And I ran into this researching, Grid of the Gods. The notation system that Babylonians used to describe higher numbers was, if we were to graph it today, it was a kind of a parenthesis notation with one number and then a comma and then another number and then a closed parenthesis. Well, interestingly enough, if you look at modern mathematical systems for notating hyperdimensional objects, in other words, take a tetrahedron and put it into four spatial dimensions. How do you describe that mathematically? Well, they use a technique called Schleife numbers, and a Schläfli number does precisely that. It gives you a bracketed set of numbers. Yeah, so in other words, even we have a clue that maybe they were thinking in some of these terms even there, which I find very interesting. It's intriguing and suggestive. Let's put it that way.
So you're saying that Schläfli numbers, in terms of set theory, even goes back to possibly Babylonian conceptions of how we can have these fourth, fifth possible, dimensions going up.
Right.
Wow.
Now it's an interesting hypothesis, and what really got me going was, and I got to tell this story because I found notions like this in three people that just blew my mind when I came across it. There are three mathematicians in the early Enlightenment, and I won't mention their names right off the top here because I want it to be kind of a surprise to people. The first guy that I read says, "Okay, yeah, I've been reading the ancient mathematicians and geometers, and it occurs to me in reading them that it looks like they may have had a form of analysis which has either been lost or suppressed." Right. And it's very clear from the context that he thinks it was suppressed, okay?
Wow.
And his name is René Descartes.
Wow, yeah, now.
I thought, okay, this guy that made all of my high school linear algebra courses, the nightmare that they were, is noticing these things. I thought, well, that's interesting. It'd be interesting to know who he's reading that he comes to that conclusion. Right. I suspect Pappus or maybe even Proclus, or
one of these Greek or Renaissance,
Neoplatonist authors that are very into mathematics. All right, so then I run into another guy, and he says, "Yeah, I've been reading the same geometers, and I've noticed kind of the same thing that Descartes has noticed, and they disguise their analysis in words." But it appears to me that they had some technique of doing things that has been lost to us. And his name is Isaac Newton.
Well, let me ask you this, because this touches on something that I've looked into a little bit the last couple of years. I think it was Daniel Jones sent me an article 2 years ago, and it was a blog that a guy had done about I'm going to draw a blank here. Gödel had found manuscripts that he believed were Leibniz's Characteristica Universalis,
right?
And that these manuscripts have been suppressed. And so, is there a possible connection with the same idea here of a universal language of logic? Yeah.
Okay, let me get to Gödel, because I was going to get there and precisely in connection with what you mentioned. Okay. The third guy that I ran across was precisely Leibniz. All right, and of the three, Leibniz is this crazy, mad genius,
Right.
And he says the same thing as Newton and Descartes, but he goes even further. He says, "I've not only noticed that they may have had a form of analysis, but that," he goes on to say, "and it had nothing to do with numbers, but they were able to produce results by what he calls an imitation of calculation." Those are his exact words. And on top of this, he not only gives you the impression that he thinks this was, again, something deliberately suppressed, but he goes on to say, "And I think I have found some lineaments of this system." Okay? And that's an extremely interesting thing to say, because I think what these three men may have done is stumbled across or been thinking in terms of something similar to what I've been calling the topological metaphor of the medium. Well, in Gödel's case, the very interesting thing is that he comes across manuscripts that he thinks indicate that Leibniz had actually developed this Characteristica Universalis, this kind of universal calculus that he was trying to create.
Kurz übersetzt, Leibniz hat den Binärcode erfunden, die Weltenformel ebenso. und die Grundlage für das Äther-Universum und die universale Sprache der Mathematik alles in Einklang gebracht bei Leibniz. Einen Tag später kommt er ins Büro und alles war weg. Es war halt Leibniz. Tesla hat dasselbe nochmal erfunden. Ha! Aber eigentlich war es Leibniz.
And that this had somehow also been suppressed. Now, I have never found, and I know the article that you're referring to that Mr. Jones sent you, because if I'm not mistaken, I may have been the one that sent it to him.
Okay.
But Gödel is an extremely interesting guy, because, you know, here's a guy that does kind of the same thing.
Right.
In his proof, he comes up with a mathematical proof, a Boolean type of proof that basically says you can't have any complete formal system. It always has to have reference to something informal. In other words, it has to have reference, if I can put it this way, to normal language.
Right.
All right. So in other words, no mathematical system, which if you look at mathematical systems a certain way, Chomskyan way, they're nothing but grammars, really. They're shorthands, Greg shorthands for big, long sentences. So I think clearly these three guys were aware that there was something going on in these ancient texts and that it had some sort of mathematical qualities to it. So yeah, I think maybe they were talking in terms, or maybe thinking in terms, kind of like what I've been talking about with this topological metaphor. And one final comment here: Leibniz actually, in some of his papers, referred to what he called analysis situ. In other words, a mathematical technique of analyzing things in situation. All right. So in other words, Leibniz is coming very, very close to the modern idea of higher order topologies. Mm-hmm. And he was actually making some significant stabs, you know, centuries ahead of the actual development of combinatorics and topology.
Yeah,
so,
right.
You know,
that's crazy. I saw
crazy.
I came across a comment in Leibniz that it sounds like a robot, and so you know he comes close to you know, well, he's obviously a formative person in the development of, you know, computers. But one thing I'd like to ask you here is that real quick, there was a little bit of a cutout on my recording at the beginning. You did say Howard Bernstein, right?
Leonard Bernstein.
Leonard Bernstein, excuse me.
Right.
So I was cut out a little bit there. Okay, so I've looked at crystallography some in the last year or two, and I see some interesting parallels with, say, some of the pop-ish writers on dimensions, like Lisa Randall. When she talks about these higher dimensions, she says we can find actual patterns of this in nature, where nature reflects the correct symmetry or geometry of what this dimension might look like, you know, tesseract and things like that. And she points to certain things like quasi-crystals and all that. So not to get too far out there, but do you think there's an interesting place for crystallography in all of this study, especially when we look at the fact that, you know, crystals are...
Kurz erklärt, eine Dimension, ein gerader Strich. Ein zweiter Strich wird zum Quadrat. Zweite Dimension. Dritte Dimension, in der wir leben. Bis zur fünften gehe ich ja notfalls noch mit. Aber wo bitte soll in mathematischer welche Form hat eine siebte Dimension? In Form eines Quaders kann es nicht sein. Ein Kubus auch nicht. Und ein, oh Gott, wie hießen die ganzen Dinger? Also, bitte, also mich würde gerne mal interessieren, welche symmetrische Form der Mathematik die siebte Dimension hat. Weil bis zur dritten ist klar, das ist hier der Würfel. Dreidimensional. Die würden nicht mal die vierte Dimension zeichnen können in mathematischer Form. Oder die fünfte, oder die sechste, oder die siebte. Warum? Weil sie nie in Mathe aufgepasst haben. Aber das ist wieder ein anderes Thema.
So, central to things like hadron colliders and different types of engines and things like that.
Oh, yes, absolutely. In fact, I pointed out in the book, Giza Death Star Deployed, where I first put out a portion of a paper that I had written privately for myself about this metaphor idea. I actually shared it with a mathematics friend of mine. He told me, he read this thing and he said, "Oh, this makes my head hurt." And he handed it back to me. He says, "Well, you're either a crackpot or this is very profound." But he said, "There's no middle ground.
No middle ground.
So take that for whatever it's worth." But I've shared some of this with other people with kind of a mathematical background. I did a private paper just in the last week and shared it with a physicist type person into information processing. Mm-hmm. With a good physics background, and she came back and said, "Yeah, this makes a lot of sense." But let's get to crystals. If you look at this topological metaphor, and you keep repeating this process of differentiating or cleaving, as I called it at the beginning, what you start to get is you get a lattice structure. Mm-hmm. You get a kind of virtual crystal that's being mathematically described. And in the Giza Death Star destroyed, I pointed out that the pyramid itself, the Great Pyramid, is a huge crystal. It's made out of crystal-bearing rock, and it's structured so that the angles of the faces are exactly the angles of a quartz crystal, the tip of a quartz crystal. So in other words, it's a huge crystal analog, let's put it that way. And then it's got, on the inside,
Schnell dir die Aussage. Die Pyramiden sind ein analoger Kristall. Nur mal so.
It's got empty structures. It's got empty places, which would function in the crystal analogy as lattice defects. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing about crystals is they have particular types of defects, screw defects, Schottky displacements, and so on and so forth, which you can describe mathematically. There are actually formulae for the energy it takes to displace a lattice, a node in the lattice. Okay. And the interesting thing about crystals is you can describe them. You can describe this lattice structure with tensor calculus, which is, of course, a higher dimensional mathematical tool of analysis that is used quite a bit, actually, in
well, you mentioned it quite a bit in unified field, so I recall. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Die Berechnung der Pyramidenstruktur. Ne? Pi ist Radius von der Mitte. Du musst die Quadratur des Kreises verstanden haben. Du musst das Wissen von Sonne, Mond und Erdachse verinnerlicht haben, um zu Quadrat zu kommen. Die Quadratur des Kreises, die dann über die nächsten geometrischen Formen dann direkt bis zur Pi-Radius von der Mitte ist die Pyramide. Ne? Du brauchst die keinen hier andersrum erklärt. Normalerweise würdet ihr bei einer Pyramide jede einzelne Seite berechnen. Wie würdet ihr das Volumen der Pyramide berechnen? Du könntest jetzt einen einzelnen Stein berechnen, du kannst 4 Seiten berechnen und unten die Seite. Klappt das alles nie. Ne? Darum geht's. Ich weiß, das ist vielleicht harter Tobak für viele. Da ist Angst vor Corona haben einfacher. Aber es ist ein unglaublich spannendes Thema.
It's it's used in general relativity. It was used by Gabriel Krohn quite a bit in his electrical engineering, which was a revolutionary step. So yeah, you can describe these things, these types of higher dimensional things, as she said, in a higher dimensional mathematical topology. And that, again, is an intriguing observation because you go back to some of the thinking in Kabbalah, Jewish esotericism, and they have this idea that space is a crystal. And, again, why would they come up?
Space is a crystal. Schön die Aussage wieder, ne? Space, der Raum ist ein Kristall. Weil Space ist ja, kannst du es nur als Universum oder als Raum? Müssen wir mal gucken, was die genaue Definition von Space ist. Aber es ist ein Kristall. Und Kristalle haben solche Fähigkeiten. Wie kannst du das Äther-Universum am besten anzappen?
With such a profound notion way back when, where's this coming from? And that's really what kind of intrigues me here is you've got all of these indications, even from some profound mathematical thinkers, that there's something going on in all of these ancient texts and mystery schools that is of a highly mathematical nature. And we've simply got to rediscover whatever this.
Und das ist der entscheidende Punkt. Die ganzen Hippie-Dokumente erfordern höhere Mathematikverständnisse. Also, yes, Spirit, wir sind im Einklang, ich, Bewusstsein. Da musst du schon ein bisschen Mathe können. Habt ihr schon mal ein Hippie und Mathe gesehen? Egal.
Is.
Yeah, Vitruvian Man, James Kelly.
Yes.
James Kelly did a good piece on how there seems to be forerunners of that in Vedic thought with the altar, the construction of the altar, and Pythagorean theorem being sort of laid out in that altar.
Right.
It also makes me think of Plato's Phaedrus or Phaedo, where at the end.
Das Krasse ist ja, wenn man jetzt den Hippies sagt, kauft alle Kristalle und sie wissen nicht, wie sie den Kristall überhaupt nutzen sollen und sie stellen ihn sich einfach bloß hin, könnte jemand, der weiß, wie man das Ding nutzt, das als globales Schienennetz quasi nutzen. Oder, es gibt so viele verrückte Theorien, wie man Unfug treiben kann, indem man andere im Unwissen leitet. Ja? Das ist beim Super Bowl, Halbzeitshow. Unten drunter opfern sie ein Kind und 3 Milliarden Menschen richten ihre Energie genau drauf. Ja, das ist das eine, was sie sehen, das andere, was in der Werbung abgeht.
There's a discussion of higher dimensions, and he says specifically that there's a crystalline structure to this other world.
Yes.
And he says that the color spectrum that we see is just a fraction of what the colors are actually out there.
Yeah.
So I've always found it amazing that, if anyone, probably the best argument I would say is when you look at these ancient texts and you see things like that, you see Plato in the Timaeus, describing.
Und das macht es ja schon wieder verrückt. Warum haben die Ägypter die alten Ägypter Katzen genommen? Was können Katzen denn sehen, was unser Spektrum nicht hergibt? War das nicht so? Wenn ich mich da jetzt nicht irre, dass Katzen da Fähigkeiten haben, besser zu sehen in anderen Bereichen, die wir gar nicht sehen. Ja, unser Blickfeld ist begrenzt. Du musst immer eine Muschi mit haben. Ja.
Sort of the subatomic and geometric structure of how things are at a very small level. There's no way he could have known that apart from something else going on.
Yeah, I think Plato, of all of these ancient writers, is probably the most intriguing because there's an American professor, Ernst McLean is his name. He's written 2 wonderful books about music theory as it's embodied in Plato's texts. One is a book called The Pythagorean Plato, and the other is called The Myth of Invariance.
An der Stelle kurzer Tipp. Zieht euch mal Beethoven bei halber Geschwindigkeit bei 432 Hertz rein. Laut Legende soll man dann automatisch Visionen haben. Ohne Drogen, ohne Schlafen, ohne Trance. Puh, geht's los. Laut Legende. Oder glaubte Beethoven wusste nichts? Du musst in der richtigen Frequenz die richtigen Sounds kombinieren mit Magnetismus und Kristallen, um dann ein Portal zu öffnen über das Ätherlicht, um dann, wer weiß was, zu betreiben. Ja, haben wir mal dazu. PS, Ätherlicht ist hellblau. Wie bei dem Tesseract. Wie bei allen Filmen, die gerade überall rumgehen. Immer wieder dieses hellblaue Licht ist. Selbst die Jedi-Ritter hatten hellblaues Licht. Das ist das Ätherlicht. Es ist schneller als Einsteins Licht, was ja rot ist. Das ist ein Unterschied. Eine Tachyonenbrille, von den Deutschen erfunden, zeigt dir die Welt, wie sie in 5 Minuten ist. Du guckst durch die Tachyonenbrille und kannst Tachyonen sehen, die schneller sind als das Licht. Und dann siehst du, was passiert, bevor es passiert. Was wiederum die Grundlage für Project Looking Glass ist. Bis hin zur Zeitmaschine. Natürlich bei Germany, wie immer. Deswegen, wer Zweifel an Trump hat, hat die Zukunft nicht gesehen. Wir haben schon gewonnen. Ihr wisst es nur Stand jetzt noch nicht.
These are two wonderful books about the ancient cosmology, the role of music theory in it. And it's very clear from his analysis that Plato is, as you say, he's coming up with this from somewhere. And Plato even provides a hint in the fact that he is indicating that he's learned many of these things. He's referring to initiation and so on and so forth. So he's getting it from somewhere. Now, one of the most interesting things about Plato is if you look at the old Jesuit Roman Catholic philosopher Copleston and his wonderful series of philosophy texts.
History, yeah.
Yeah, Copleston comes up with a very interesting table of how the Platonic system works, and he has Ta Mathematica, the mathematicals is what Plato calls them, where these are the higher forms. And it's interesting that Plato uses this word, because had he known the term, or had he had access to higher order topologies, he would have probably called them the topologies, all right? But his hint here is something very profound, because what he's suggesting is that the standard academic presentation of the world of the universals, of the forms, is not simply, a chair, a universal chair that has the form of all chairs. What he's actually suggesting is that this is a mathematical entity, rather than, a chair in the sun, or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, I think these guys are clearly giving clues that they're receiving a heritage, and they're trying to explain it as best as they can. Another one along those lines would be Iamblichus, the Neoplatonic philosopher, the theology of arithmetic. And it's very clear that he's dealing in a very metaphorical way with highly abstract mathematical ideas. Oops.
Let me ask you this, because the first thing I think of is that, again, for persons who might be skeptical or think that this doesn't have any real relevance or connection to things today, that we've all, we've parsed all this out into a kind of reductionism where math is just token symbols and all this stuff. This is from Werner Heisenberg. He says all the particles, he's talking about things at the subatomic level. He says all particles are made of the same substance, energy, but the resemblance of the modern views to those of Plato and the Pythagoreans can be carried somewhat further. The elementary particle in Plato's Timaeus are finally not substance, but mathematical forms. He says the equation of motion holds at all times. It is in this sense eternal, whereas the geometrical forms, like the orbits, are changing. Therefore, the mathematical forms that represent the elementary particles will be solutions of some eternal law of motion for matter. This is a problem which has not yet been resolved. So here we have Werner Heisenberg, one of the premier quantum physicists, saying that, at that level of reality, the subatomic level, we're actually dealing with what he specifically says, Platonic Pythagorean notions here.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm glad you read that quotation. Isn't that from Physics and Philosophy? One of his 2 books he wrote on. Heisenberg is interesting here, because what he's suggesting is something I've been trying to communicate to people. People think of particles and quantum mechanics as being these little tiny billiard balls, that they're
Right.
whirling around in their Large Hadron Colliders. And what they really are they're packets of mathematical information.
Right.
That's exactly what Heisenberg is saying, and again, he's exactly right, because you look at the mathematical descriptions of these things, and what they're really doing is they're describing topologies, geometries that are the only way that you can describe these things and make any sense out of them. And that raises all sorts of conundrums about, well, exactly what are they spinning around?
Es ist so faszinierend, was der erzählt. Also, ich hoffe, ihr versteht es halbwegs gut. Für mich fallen viele Worte auch relativ schwer, aber es ist wirklich faszinierend. Weil es ein komplett anderes Weltbild ist in der physikalischen Ebene. Das ist das Deutsche. Ja? Leibniz. Wie ist der andere? Und von Heisenberg. Und der dazwischen, der hab ich den Namen jetzt vergessen. Es sind immer wieder die Deutschen, die verrückten Ideen haben. Deswegen gibt es auch 200 Jahre deutsche Raumfahrt. Das ist genau der Shit.
They're machines.
Yeah, right.
And I take the view, they're spinning around little packets of mathematical information.
Well, Brian Greene even says that in his pop books. He even says that at that level, it seems to be information. We have studies coming out that light encodes information. So let me ask you this: what is your view of light in relationship to these things?
Well, you have the wave-particle duality in modern mathematical descriptions of light. And, this led to all sorts of philosophical, and they're still going on,
right,
philosophical debates in modern physics. But the bottom line is, and let's go back with this to something that you pointed out with an earlier quotation from the Pythagoreans, I believe it was, that you're looking at one very small end of the spectrum, okay? Light is energy.
Mm-hmm.
So as such, it's got a specific information content in the form of frequency.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at the whole spectrum, not just the auditory spectrum, but not just the optical spectrum, but the entire spectrum of the harmonic series. And something very interesting pops out.
Kurzum, das Licht, was ihr seht, das ist alles eine Form von Energie. Wir sehen aber nur eine bestimmte Form des Lichtes. Das andere Licht ist ja trotzdem da. Das ist das, was die Katze gerne sieht. Ja? Nennen wir es mal so, das Katzenlicht. Oh, wenn das blöd klingt. Wenn du dieses Licht, was ja da ist, quasi nutzen kannst, anzapfen, jetzt nicht mit Solarzellen, sondern eher über Kristalle als Speicher von Energie, Wasser als Energiespeicher, das ist ja alles Energiespeicher, Informationsspeicher. Wisst ihr, wie viel Energie in Plaste drin steht? Oh Gott, der ganze Planet ist verdreckt mit Plaste. Oh mein Gott, wir werden alle sterben. Ja, und das ist alles Energie. Und das werden wir nie wieder los. Aber wir werden die Energie nicht los, okay. Ich denke, wir haben Energieprobleme. Dort liegt Plaste. Geht los. Also, ihr müsst euer Denken auf so vielen Ebenen verändern. Was glaubt ihr, warum ich früher rumgerannt bin mit einem Zirkel und einem Metermaß, um die Proportionen zu vermessen, um die perfekte Pobacke zu finden, die dann im Einklang mit dem Universum direkt unter dem Polarstern das Wort H, Mond und I. Du kommst nur in Harmonie, wenn du direkt unter dem Polarstern, wo sich alles dreht. In perfekte Mathematik. Und dann musst du halt dann auch hier erstmal eine Woche lang mit dem Zirkel gegen den Po, um zu gucken, aber Quatsch.
I've mentioned this many, many times in my books, and I'm not sure that I've ever put it clearly enough for people to really latch on to. The first unification in physics is not electromagnetism, it's music.
Right.
And
Music. Musik und Physik sind dasselbe Fach. Du bist in Musik gut, aber in Physik schlecht. Oh. Du bist in Physik gut, aber in Musik schlecht. Oh. Bist du aber in beiden gut. Musik ist Physik. Das ist dasselbe. Hören wir weiter zu.
The reason why is, and again, this is what Bernstein brings out in his lectures so very well in the very first lecture. If you take any fundamental, say the note C on a piano keyboard, in the naturally occurring harmonic series, there's going to be an overtone that lies in the crack between B flat and A in the naturally occurring series.
Also, wenn du schon mal Musik gemacht hast und weißt, was Overtones sind und wie sich Harmonie innerhalb der Musiktheorie bis hin zur Trance und du nur hey ja, oder auch der Afrikaner mit 4, 5, 4, 3, 4, 5, der macht nicht immer 4, 4, 4, 4, 4 auf der Bongo, der macht 5, 3, 2, 4. Es ist komplett, aber innerhalb des Chaos entsteht eine neue. Es ist wie wenn du auf Party auf dem DJ-Pult stehst, jeder Einzelne tanzt anders unten. Aber wenn du von weiter oben guckst, siehst du, wie es eine Welle ist. Guckst auf den Einzelnen, denkst du dir als Opfer, aber siehst du das Ganze, siehst du eine Welle. Es ist eine Welle. Ja, mal dazu.
And what this meant was, if you were to tune a keyboard instrument to the natural series, you could not modulate or change key from one key to another during the course of a piece. You'd have to stop and retune the entire instrument in order to do that. So what happened was, and the Pythagoreans pick up on this, they call this the Pythagorean comma. What happened was, is you have from a very early period in Vedic literature and Pythagorean literature, you have this idea that if we just could figure out what this interval was, we could tweak it. We could engineer, and this is a key word here, we could engineer a slight adjustment to make the harmonic series perform with all 12 notes. Interesting, it's a Sumerian number, 12 notes, on the keyboard and bring about a unification of the harmonic series. Now, let's take that idea, which they did, of course. You know, this is what happens finally in Western music after the Renaissance. You have that mathematical adjustment being done, which gives rise to our Western music that we still listen to today, from Bach to the Beatles. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is, what happens then? What could we find an interval to do that with the entire harmonic series?
Schon das bisschen, was der jetzt über Musik erzählt hat, erklärt so vieles, warum die CIA so interessiert war, Rockmusik zu beflecken, jede Form von Musik zu beflecken. Weil dort entstehen ja Energien. Ja, das muss man verstehen. Und wenn die Musik dort in der richtigen Frequenz gespielt wird und die richtigen, man hat es ja bei den Beatles getestet, me, you, too, I love you, solche Worte, die sich an der richtigen Frequenz, es gibt Worte, die alle in derselben Frequenz schwingen, wie alles, du kannst den ganzen Satz, wie ein Ton pro Gramm, 1 Gramm pro Ton. Ein Ton pro Gramm, 1 Gramm pro Ton. Das ist ja alles innerhalb desselben Frequenzspektrums. Da gibt es ganze Sätze in dem. Und wenn du die dann halt passend so, kriegst du diesen Ohrwurm-Effekt. Und Trance gleichzeitig. Und wenn dann alle Energien gleichzeitig, nee, dass dort das Ätherlicht aufgeht, dann musst du da so rein. Nicht, dass die alle plötzlich Visionen haben.
And of course, once you've put it that way, you've basically raised the question of a physical unification of sciences based around light. Now, interestingly enough, the physicist David Bohm actually made some stabs in that.
Und hat die Glocke nicht ein mysteriöses Geräusch gemacht? War das nicht so? Hm? Es ist wirklich faszinierend. Die haben dort absichtlich einen Sound erzeugt. Einen Tune. Guck den Film. Der Dune und Tune. Ja. Über Frequenzen kannst du jeden Shit machen. Bis hin zur Flugmaschine. Wenn du sie richtig steuern kannst, wenn du weißt, dass es sie gibt und wenn du weißt, dass es die Lichter gibt, die du gar nicht siehst, dann kannst du anzapfen. Weil das Ätherlicht wird sichtbar. Was ist denn jetzt? Ach, der Kosten macht laut. Ja, das Ätherlicht wird sichtbar.
That direction. He tried to compute what that, or calculate what that number may have been. And I don't recall right off the top of my head what it was. But he made some stabs in that direction. So yeah, I think light here again is, so many mystical treatises from all the way from India to medieval Europe are talking about light as somehow fundamental to all of this. And again, we have indicators that it very well may be.
Yeah, it makes me think of Renaissance thinkers as well as ancient Greek thinkers having the idea of the celestial sphere and the celestial intelligences sort of resonating at different pitches or notes.
Yes. Yeah, and this is, it's all the way from Dionysius the Areopagite to Sigurd Brahma. You have this idea of light. And again, the question is why? Where is this coming from? And I suspect, along with Newton and Leibniz and Descartes, I suspect that somehow this is all part of a very high science that may have existed in high antiquity that was subsequently lost or perhaps deliberately obscured. Mm-hmm. And they've been trying to get back to it. And Heisenberg, again, you mentioned that wonderful quotation from Heisenberg. Heisenberg is one of these very erudite, learned men of letters, which scientists back then tended to be. And Heisenberg is expressing something, I think, very profound that scientists back then, Heisenberg, Paul Dirac, Walter Gerlach, these guys were very aware that they were getting close to something that looked very similar to some.
Für die sich fragen, warum mich das interessiert. Ich plane, dass meine Couch irgendwann fliegen kann. Wenn die das damals hinkriegen und mit hier während des Krieges, grob, wenn die schon im 18. Jahrhundert hier mit deutschen Flugmaschinen, dann kann das nie so schwer sein, wenn die das hinkriegen. Ja? Und irgendwann kann meine Couch fliegen. Von daher ist es wirklich, ich finde es geil, solche Blickwinkel. Weil das Gesamtbild ist dann meistens entscheidend.
Very ancient ideas.
Yeah.
And, to me, that's another indicator that there's something going on way back when.
What do you think about Dirac's idea that energy is kind of borrowed from the future, and rather than everything being this sort of negative vacuum, that we're actually in the midst of a constant sea of energy? I mean, that seems to fit well with the idea that everything is basically energy at a certain level.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think Dirac is correct.
Alle Energie kommt aus der Zukunft, habe ich das richtig verstanden, und wird in ein negatives Vakuum gezogen und fließt durch uns dauerhaft durch irgendwie. Verrückte Vorstellung. Das müsste man echt mal komplett übersetzen oder nur mal hochladen. Das ist echt schade, dass es da keine Übersetzung komplett gibt. Weil der Shit ist echt freaky.
And Dirac and John Stuart Bell and people like this. Dirac is an interesting guy because, as you say, he's got this idea that you're borrowing energy from the future. Well, if that's the case, what people really have to latch onto here is what Dirac is really suggesting is that time in the mathematical descriptions of relativity, the way that time as simply a delta t function or a fourth coordinate in a coordinate system, that's an inadequate mathematical description. What he's suggesting, if I can use the mathematical term, he's suggesting that time is not a scalar. In other words, it's not that first point in the Pythagorean tetratus. It's further down. It's got its own kind of multidimensional characteristics. Well, that's interesting because in the Soviet Union, back in the late 50s, early 60s, a very famous Soviet astrophysicist by the name of Nikolai Kozyrev. Nikolai Kozyrev was noticing that the sun, according to the chained up hydrogen bomb model, wasn't spitting out enough neutrinos. Okay. So he decided, well, there has to be some other energy source going on here. And he speculated that it was time, following Dirac's suggestion.
Alter, fuck. Das ist so krass, was der labert. Es kann nicht nur die Sonne als Energieform geben, weil es ja auch im Dunkeln die da, denke ich mal. Also, was ist die zweite Energieform, die ja dauerhaft Energie sendet? Es ist die Zeit. Ein dauerhafter Fluss aus der Zukunft zu uns. Fragt mich jetzt nie, wie das gehen soll. Ich sag der Blowjob-Motor, wir lassen uns voransaugen. Ja, muss bloß ein Vakuum erzeugen und saugt sich rein. Wenn du hinter dir einen Propeller hast, der so rotiert, dass es vor dir weniger Widerstand gibt als hinter dir, dann rollst du von alleine nach vorn. Das ist halt simpel einfach. Der Name Blowjob-Motor ist halt ein bisschen, aber das ist halt, die meisten verstehen es so. Ja. Hochmathematische Vorgänge kann man so am einfachsten erklären. Aber das Prinzip ist ja trotzdem klar. Wenn ein chinesischer Torpedo so schnell fährt und sich so schnell rotiert, dass vor ihm ein Luftvakuum entsteht, dann hat er null Widerstand. Unter Wasser. Muss halt nur schnell genug drehen. Du brauchst keinen Hyperloop bauen, du musst dich nur schnell bewegen, wahrscheinlich. Was ja dann hieß, auch die fucking Flash-Serie. Weil er sich so schnell bewegt, dass er durch Wände gehen kann. Kein Plan. Werden wir sehen. Immer wieder spannend.
And what happened then, Jay, was very interesting. What happened then was Kozyrev was roundly denounced in Pravda as a quack, a fraud.
Yeah.
And this guy is an internationally renowned astrophysicist. So in other words, it's like suddenly calling Einstein a fraud and a charlatan. Okay.
Well, and the Soviet Party had that guidelines where the party determined.
Wie meinst du das mit Baron Münchhausen? Würde ein neues Licht auf ihn werfen? Welche Story von Münchhausen könnte denn... Klär mich mal auf, das Lokale. Das Thema ist Licht. Es gibt eine zweite Energiequelle, die dauerhaft sendet. Durch jeden von uns, durch alles, immer, überall, gleich. Tesla hat sie angezapft. Den Äther. Keine Ahnung. Das ist ja immer noch da. Ja. Das heißt jetzt nicht, dass ihr euch einen Kristall in den Po stecken sollt. Nur um experimentell gucken, was dann passiert. Das müsste ich mal ein Hippie erklären. Echt mal, das müsste ich mal Hippies. Nee, das würden die wahrscheinlich wirklich machen. Das ist nie gut. So, Rechner hängt. Oh, wie So, tschick. Gucken, ob das Tür jetzt da läuft. Geh weg. Tschick. Stream ist wieder da. Gut. Werbung, Mozilla, super. Geh weg. Sitzung herstellen. So. Lustig, lustig.
All right, this is Jay's analysis.
To develop the hypotheses of what they might be dealing with, number two. And I think they're going to look at quite a few, quite frankly. But number three, they're going to develop a crash program on the hypothesis that some UFOs represent a technology, whether human or...
Sorry, my father was an engineer, so I kind of grew up with kind of a heavy emphasis in my education on sciences, on mathematics, and so on. When I was in grad or junior high school, I was placed into kind of an accelerated mathematics program. And that interest in math and physics has always stayed with me, even though I went into other areas academically.
Nö, die Quali nervt mich, aber das Ding ist auch nochmal krass. So. Gut. Es ist immer wieder faszinierend. Mal gucken, ob das wieder normal läuft hier. So. Scheinbar schon. Gut, zusammen mal von Telekom hier gewechselt. Ja, mich hat es gerade überall rausgehauen. Deswegen, das juckt mich schon gar nicht mehr. Aber es ist immer wieder faszinierend zu sehen. Aktuell gehen ja unglaubliche Dinger gegen Trump schon wieder vor. Trump der Böse, Trump der Böse. Wieso schießen die gerade jetzt los, wo Trump zurückkommt? Woher wissen die das? Oder wissen die das? Wer gab ihnen den Fehl? Ich finde das so süß. Auch diese Corona-Informationsseite. Was nicht gerade alles? Attila schießt wieder gegen Trump. Die schießen alle gegen Trump gerade schon wieder. Bestimmte Gruppen. Finde ich spannend. Nur weil er wiederkommt. Trump hat gesagt, der hat sich boostern lassen. Ja, redet er denn von Boostern? So wie ihr denkt, dass es Boostern ist? Oder redet er von was ganz anderem, was geboostert wurde? Und plötzlich kommt der neue Hund ins Weiße Haus. Namens Commander. Trump sagt, jetzt wird geboostert. Und der neue Hund kommt rein. Die Leute sind manchmal so dumm da draußen. Das hat beides nichts miteinander zu tun. Trump redet vom Boostern, also vom Impfen, Todesstrafe, so gesehen. Und dann kommt ein Hund ins Weiße Haus. Da denkt man wirklich nach jetzt 4 Jahren, die Leute, die meckern, die hören ja nicht mal zu, die gucken sich ja nicht mal die Vorträge an. Deswegen kannst du von simpel einfach, heute habe ich eine gefunden, das war eine Hundezüchterin. Aha. Und du bist jetzt Finanz- und geopolitische Expertin, sowie historisch. Ich finde das so süß. Ja, du hast deine Meinung, aber kannst es dann auch belegen. Anhand von, na, dass es hier täglich vorangeht, sieht jeder. Sag mir mal einen Terrorleader, der noch lebt. Gib mal Terrorleader killed, died oder Hellfire dahinter. Und du findest in jedem Land, also Asien, Afrika, überall Middle East, überall schon weg. Alle tot. Chefrabbis. Gib mal Chief Rabbi resign, die, step down, arrested. Einfach mal eingeben und gucken, wie viel rauskommt. Du kommst bei 208 raus. Der Zionisten-Trump. Aha. Deswegen wird in Israel jetzt die Todesstrafe eingeführt und öffentlich darüber diskutiert, dass ein Jude einen anderen Juden töten darf aufgrund seiner Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit, weil ja Trump der Zionist ist. Keiner von denen traut sich in die öffentliche Diskussion. Das ist schon das beste Zeichen dafür, dass das nichts wert ist. Ich habe Argumente, die meistens nicht mal eine Antwort. Die blocken sofort. Es ist wirklich faszinierend. Aber während andere immer noch schmollen und denken, die Welt geht unter. Ja, bis zum Tag der Auferstehung wird es jetzt nochmal schlimm. Es ist nun mal biblische Auferstehung jetzt am 26. 24., 25., 26. Aber wir haben doch jetzt Nachtwende gehabt. Jetzt beginnt das Licht. Die Dunkelheit ist zu Ende. Deswegen kommt doch Operation Sunrise. Es ist eigentlich so einfach. Aber sie wollen es trotzdem nicht verstehen. Warum? Weil sie sonst keinen mehr hochkriegen. Daran liegt es. Wette ich. Ohne Angstporno kriegen die nichts mehr hin. In diesem Sinne, Stunde reicht. Ich werde noch ein bisschen auf Discord rumhängen. Niemand fragt sich, wo die Matrix und Resident Evil gerade jetzt rauskommen. Ich habe sie beide schon geguckt jetzt. Ein Virus und die Matrix kommen gleichzeitig kurz vor Weihnachten raus und sind sofort fast in Top-Quali online, damit es auch jeder sehen kann. Weil das Rainer ist. Und Rainer ist bald 19. In diesem Sinne, bis gleich auf Discord.